So my name is John Mayer. I'm the director of the Amesbury Carriage Museum. I see many familiar faces, but I also see many new faces, so that's a wonderful thing. It's so nice to have you come out tonight. Of course, it feels like springtime. So I'm pleased to welcome you to this program tonight, Amesbury Through Early Artifacts, with our speaker, Steve Klomps. But before we begin, got a little work I have to do. First, I want to direct your attention to our two information tables that are at the entrance, where you can learn about upcoming programs that the Carriage Museum is offering, and also events that the Amesbury 350th Committee has planned. I'd like to say thanks to our volunteers who are staffing the tables. We have Marcy and Bonnie Brady and Mary Chatney and Karen Batiste, and we had people donate the beverages, Susan Grant, Courtney McLaughlin, Bonnie Brady for that. So please, after the program, feel free to linger. There's lots of refreshments over there. Your job is to make sure that the planners that'd be awesome. So I'd like to also recognize the support that the Carriage Museum has received from the Amesbury 350th Committee. They've given us a grant to help pay for our program series that we're going to be offering throughout the year, so we're very appreciative of that. And it turns out Provident Bank was a major sponsor of the 350th program, so we're thankful for Provident Bank for helping with that series of events. But I also have to thank the Amesbury Carriage Museum program sponsors. We are in some ways we're young, we've been around for 30 years, we're an emerging museum, we're trying to be much more active in the community. And we do have a sponsorship program, and we're grateful for some of the businesses who have come forward, and they've given us some funding to help us do our events and programs. Edward Jones, Gold Insurance, Newburyport 5 Cent Savings Bank, Paul C. Rogers and Son, the RTN Credit Union, and Sylvan Street Grill and Salisbury. We totally appreciate people recognizing the work that we're doing and giving us support to do that. So if you would help me, I'd like to say thanks to those. And as the executive director, I am good at shameless plugs. I know many of you are members, but some of you aren't. So we are a membership organization. If you're interested in the kinds of things that we're doing, I totally welcome you to join as a member. You can find out about the Carriage Museum on our website, amesburycarriagemuseum.com, or volunteers at the table have information sheets that they can share with you. There's a sign-up, and you can at least put your name on an email list, and you'll get more newsletters, and you'll know what to do with. We have a couple programs that are coming up on March 26th with Brewery Sabbaticus, where you're going to have our third program called History on Tap. It's just a social event, but we're going to learn about how they brew their beer. It's free, open to the public. We'll have light snacks, and there'll be an opportunity to sample their product. For those who are interested, I recommend it. Our next lecture here will feature Edith Maxwell, who's in the audience, and her program is called Amesbury Women, Daily Life Around the 1890s. So that will be here again in the Senior Center on April 18th. One really interesting program that I can't take all the credit for is a special program called the Mass Memories Roadshow. I am working with 10 other organizations to bring this event to Amesbury. It's run by UMass Boston. And what basically it is, it's a community scrapbook. People are invited to bring 3 photographs. They'll be scanned, they'll be uploaded into an album. You get your photographs back. But at the end of it, after it's all been processed, we'll have this wonderful record of Amesbury in 2018. So that's on April 21st. It's at the Amesbury High School. And I hope you all will want to come to that. And then the last program I'm going to mention on May 16th is our Bailey Family Lecture. This year we're featuring a professor from UMass Amherst. His name is Max Page, and his theme is Why Preservation Matters. And what he'll be talking about is historic preservation as a force in shaping communities. We all know about saving old buildings, this is a little bit more about why it's important to do that. So we have a calendar up at the table. Please grab it. You'll find out about that on the website. And I'm delighted to see you. It's nice to have such a good turnout. And now, the reason we all came. And pleased to introduce Steve Klomps. Steve is a friend and a colleague. Steve has been part of a group that I put together when I started working in Amesbury 2 years ago, the Amesbury Industry Survey Group. Steve is a member of the Amesbury Historical Commission and a board member with the Bartlett Museum. I think many of you know Steve is a longtime resident of Amesbury. He's a historian with a passion of discovery. He shared that with me, and I totally appreciate that. And what I think he's going to tell us tonight is how he uses source materials of all types to find the history of our community. So, Steve, thank you.
I'm going to see if I can work without the microphone. If everybody can hear me all right, is that going to be okay? Because I kind of like to move around a little bit. I don't want to be tied down by that. Thank you for the introduction, John. And again, thank you all for coming out this wonderful summer evening to share a little bit of history with us tonight. This is a bit of show and tell. What I've done is brought a couple items that I can share with you and talk about, and hopefully show how some of these physical objects can actually help to bring Amesbury history alive. It just adds kind of an interesting dimension to things. So we'll get right off the bat. I'm going to talk about all three of them kind of together, and then we can open up for questions at the end if there's any further questions that you may have. The first item I wanted to talk about is this brick, which may not seem all that interesting, but if you look at it closely, you may notice that it's a little unusual in its size. It's longer, wider, and thinner than most of the bricks that most of us would be familiar with. And the reason for that is that this is what is known as an English statute brick. It was made to specific measurements that were established in England in 1577 during the reign of Queen Elizabeth. And it was the standard size or statute brick that was made in England and in the English colonies through the 1600s. The other thing you may notice is it's very uneven. And that's because it's basically a product of handwork. It was made by hand by a brickmaker. They would have placed a wooden form on the ground, filled it with wet clay, and then he actually took his hand and scraped off the excess in the mold, where they let it dry for a bit. Then it was removed, dried some more, and then fired to make it nice and hard. And what you can actually see by looking at this brick, you can see the indentation of grass and gravel on the ground where it was set. You can see striations when it was removed from the wooden mold. And you can actually see the fingerprints of the brickmaker for when he scraped the excess off. It looks like he did it yesterday, but this is well over 300 years old. So it's really interesting to see, this in person and how it seems immediate, but it really has some history here. The thing that really makes it interesting is that this was found in Amesbury. And it played a large role in helping the Historical Commission understand the actual history of the old Morel house on Congress Street. Now, most of you, or many of you, probably are familiar with that house. It stood on the south side of Congress Street, a little east of Elm Street, for many, many years. Traditionally, it was thought to be the home of Jacob Morrill, who was born in 1648, and he married in 1674, so the thinking was that he probably built his house about that time when he was married. The house passed down through many generations of his descendants well into the 20th century, and then about the mid-20th century it was sold. Many of you probably know it as sitting vacant for many decades, for quite a while. Unfortunately fell into considerable disrepair and ultimately came before the Historical Commission with the demolition application a few years ago. Now what we did to do our due diligence is we wanted to do a site view so we could actually examine the house to know what we were dealing with. And so we actually went and took a physical exam of the house to see. And not that I'm sure you were looking for a detailed history of architectural history in terms of things, but it's helpful to know that when a house is built, it is built with materials and using methods and style that are popular at the time it's built. And there's also a fairly well understood chronology of what those materials, techniques, and styles are. So a close examination of a house, you can pretty well identify within a reasonable time frame when it was actually built. So that's what we were trying to do when we did the site view. And when we got there, what we noticed right away is that the house was built in two different phases, in two very different periods. The right-hand part of the house, which is the south side, showed some very interesting indications that it possibly could be early, maybe dating back to the 1600s, and it possibly could have been Jacob Morrill's original house. The main feature there was the fact that it consisted of one large room, about 20 feet square, that was 2 stories high, and it had a narrow lean-to on the back of it. The other side of the house, the left or north side, was obviously built in the mid-1700s, quite a bit later. At that point, it had 2 smaller rooms that were front to back, rather than one large room and a narrow lean-to. So that told us that that was later what we would call the second period, probably mid-1700s. And it also retained some original woodwork that would give us an indication from a stylistic standpoint that that was appropriate. So we figured probably about 1760 to 1770. Now the interesting part of the house that really caught our interest, again, because it had that large 20 by 20 foot room, you could see where there had been what's called a summer beam that stretched across the middle of the room and the ceiling that helped basically divide the span of the floor joist. So it was a way to span a large area like that. That had been removed, but we could see marks where we knew it had been. And so what we were interested in is that if it was originally dating back to the 1600s, it would have had an exposed frame. So the posts, the beams would have been open and exposed to the inside of the room. And as a result, it would have been decorated with chamfers or molding on the exposed portions of the structure. Unfortunately, in the Morrill house, these have been covered over with wooden boards, so we couldn't see the actual structure. So we asked the owner, because he wanted to tear it down, for permission to remove some of those cover boards so we could see what was behind it, so to really get a feel for what we were dealing with. And when we did that, unfortunately what we found is that the structure, although it was oak, did not have any decorative chamfers or molding cut into it. It was never intended to be exposed. The wooden boards were original to the construction, which indicated that it was early second period, not first period, probably dated to the late 1720s, early 1730s, rather than the 1600s. So that was a disappointment, but at least we knew what we were dealing with. Then a few of the more adventurous members of the commission crawled underneath the crawl space of the newer part of the house and actually found some interesting things. We saw that some of the floor joists for that part of the house were heavy chamfered oak beams that were what we would have expected to see in the original 17th century house if it was there. And as we were digging around in the dirt towards the center of the structure, we started finding fragments of bricks and a few intact bricks that when we brought out to the light of day and looked at the dimensions, we realized that we were dealing with these English statute bricks, which dated it to the 17th century. So when we left that day, it was quite a long day, we were kind of confused because we were finding evidence of early 17th century materials, but associated with the new part of the house, not the old part of the house. So we had to think a little bit about it, and we had some further discussions, and actually were able to, primarily because of the brick and what we found under the floor beams of the new side, we realized that we were able to understand what the actual evolution of the house was on that property. It was the site of Jacob Morrill's original house, built probably around 1674. And when he died, that house passed to his youngest son. And probably, again, in the late 1720s, early 1730s, as his family was growing, he built an addition to the south side of the original house, which was the old part of what we were seeing when we did our analysis. And then as it passed down to probably the next or the subsequent generation in the mid-1700s, they were probably dealing with a very old original house that was not in very good repair. And what they did about 1760, 1770 is they took that house down, built a new house on that part of the site and reused, being frugal Yankees, they salvaged some of the old materials from the original house to put into the new house. So that's why we saw the floorboard. We figure probably at that time is when they knocked down the original chimney and just buried the bricks underneath the new part in the crawl space. But it was by being able to find this that we were able to determine, number one, that it was not the original house of Jacob Morrill. It was an early house, but it was not from the 1700s or 1600s. But we had a good understanding of what it was. And unfortunately, we also discovered during our examinations that the house had been modified. Several of the main structural posts had been cut off at the first floor, so structurally it was not adequate. We found other posts that had severe insect and water damage, so they were there, but they basically weren't holding anything up. So unfortunately, it was in pretty bad shape. So after all this investigation, the commission determined that the house was historically significant, but that it was not properly preserved because it was just in such bad condition. So we allowed the demolition to proceed, but the owners did give us access to this site both before and after the demolition so that we could go in and remove and salvage some of the units like the brick that we thought were important to preserve. So it was, again, the loss of a house, but we gained a lot of information and we gained some very interesting artifacts as a result of that. The next item I want to talk about actually is associated with Karen Batistas, and I know she's in the audience here. This is an old woodworking plane that came from her family, which are the descendants of Frank Morrill, who, along with Lowell's Boat Shop, was one of the last of the boat builders along the Merrimack River. His boat shop was located just a short distance downriver from Lowell's Boat Shop, and that's where he worked building boats until he retired in 1958. So he was one of the last active boat builders there. This is a rather interesting plane in that it's got a few unusual features. You can see that the back has been cut down and then a handle set in low into the body of the plane so that it's very efficient when the woodworker is using this, you're applying pressure down and forward, and having a handle and having it set into the body of the plane makes it much more efficient for doing heavy work. It's also made from a very unique wood that's not normally used in making wooden planes. This is made of an imported exotic wood that's called lignum vitae. And it's a very heavy, very dense wood that has a lot of natural oils in it. And it was actually imported to this area, or everywhere, to be used in shipbuilding for components, wood components that were used in the rigging of sailing ships. So for dead eyes and blocks, that kind of thing. The dense hard wood and the oils made it very durable and made it very resistant to the harsh marine environment. So it was an ideal wood to have for that application. So seeing this in the hands or coming down to the family of a boat builder just raised some questions to say this probably predated that activity. The building of boats in Amesbury we know very well because of Lowell's Boat Shop. And for those of you who are not familiar with that or haven't visited, I highly recommend that you go see Lowell's because it does tell a wonderful story and it's a great resource for Amesbury. But this tells an earlier story. And what I wanted to do was look at the family of Frank Morrill to see if I could figure out how this might have passed down from an earlier period to a boat builder. And I found that Frank was the son of an earlier Frank Morrill Sr., who was a boat builder, had the same shop on the point. He, in turn, was the son of Alfred Morrill, who was a boat builder. And his father, Ezra Morrill, was a little more difficult to find. I only found one deed where his occupation was outlined, and they called him a seaman or a mariner. So he was associated with vessels, but we don't know as a builder, but definitely as a sailor. We do know that Ezra was the son of George Morrill, who worked for many years as a shipwright in the old Morel shipyard that was located on Point Shore in Amesbury. That's located just upriver from the old Long Wharf, which was located at the foot of Rocky Hill Road. So there was a major shipyard basically just upriver from Rocky Hill Road, and that's where George was working as a shipwright. He, in turn, was the son of Israel Morrill, who owned and operated the Morrill shipyard there for many, many years. And he, in turn, was the son of Jacob Morrill, who established a shipyard there in 1767. So there was a lot of boat building and shipbuilding in that family's history. And it so turns out that the first Jacob Morrill who established that shipyard was the grandson of Jacob Morrill, whose house we talked about on Congress Street right before. So it goes all the way back. And that Jacob Morrill was also a shipwright. Even though he lived in the middle of town, he worked at the foot of Water Street and then had a shipyard where his stepson had a house in down on Merrimack Road in Pleasant Valley. So it was rather interesting that the history of shipbuilding and this plane probably passed down, was a cherished tool used all the way through, and even probably to Frank, since he kept it and left it with his other tools. Now the history of shipbuilding is not nearly as well known as the boat building history or other things like the carriage industry or the textile industry, primarily because it ended so early that it's just not so close to memory. And I have been researching, many of you who know me know that that's been a passion of mine for a number of years. And what I'm finding is that the actual history of shipbuilding in Amesbury is earlier and far more important than our traditions tell us. So there's quite a story there that I'm still exploring, trying to reconstruct from historical records. And really don't have time to go into that much tonight, but I do want to let you know that later this year I'm planning to lead a walking tour from the Bartlett Museum down to the ferry area and along Point Shore to Lowell's Boat Shop to talk about shipbuilding and the shipyards located in that area. So for those of you who are interested, keep an eye out for that future program, and we can have some fun with that. The final item that I wanted to bring with you, or share with you tonight, is this wonderful little silver spoon. This is handmade probably in the late 1700s, very early 1800s, by a known American silversmith by the name of William Little. It has his hallmark on the back, so you can identify who made it. And I was interested in this because I was familiar with the name William Little from Merrill's History of Amesbury. He's one of the individuals that Morrill names as one of the founders of the carriage industry in Amesbury. So this silver spoon kind of led me on a little diverse course of research from silversmithing into the early history of carriage making. Now, many of you are probably familiar with Morrill's history, but under the year 1800, he gives a fairly brief, what is pretty obviously a traditional history that was accepted at the time of the early origins of the industry. He names three individuals, William Little, who he calls a plater, and what that means is somebody who plates base metal objects with either silver or gold, usually buckles that were used in shoes and clothing and harnesses, and also plating metal items that went on early carriages. So he was identified by Morrill in the history, along with a gentleman by the name of Michael Emery, who he calls a carpenter or woodworker. And then thirdly, he lists Stephen Bailey, who he says was the trimmer. And aside from that, he really doesn't tell much about who these people are or what they did. So it kind of piqued my interest to see if I could figure out more about them. So you'll have to bear with me a little bit because I'm going to get a little bit into detail with a lot of dates and things because it's important to establish the timeline. But I'm not going to have a quiz at the end, so you don't have to worry about that. But what I found, I started looking at William Little. He was born in that part of Newbury that was set off as Newburyport. He was born in 1745. He was trained as a silversmith, worked as a silversmith, lived in Newburyport. But I found that his wife was named Mary Rowell, and she was the daughter of Thomas Rowell, who was a prominent resident of the West Parish of Amesbury. And when Thomas died in 1790, he left his house and 20 acres of land in the West Parish to his daughter and to William Little. And I found that soon after, at least by 1792, they had packed up their family and moved north across the river and settled in her father's house in West Amesbury, where William Little continued to work as a silversmith. So that brought him from Newburyport to Amesbury, so it started to make some sense. But as I was looking at the deed record, I was kind of surprised to find that in 1801, William Little sold his house in West Amesbury to his son John Little, and he moved north to Salem, New Hampshire. So he was in Amesbury, but he was in Amesbury only a very short period of time from when Morrill records him as starting the carriage industry to when he left. So it just raised a question in my mind. I then looked at Michael Emery, and he was a little harder, not a lot of information on him, but I did find that he was born in Newbury in 1764, and he was the youngest of 9 children. And even though he would have been of age when they conducted the first census of the United States in 1790, he's not listed as a head of household, nor is he listed in the census of 1800. So it made me think that he was probably unmarried and living in the household of one of his older siblings in Newbury. What I did find in the Newbury Vital Records is in October of 1804, there's a record of his marriage intention that says, Michael Emery of Newbury to Sarah Sargent of Amesbury. And in the Amesbury Vital Records, in November of 1804, they have the record of the marriage of Sarah Sargent of Amesbury and Michael Emery of Newbury. So those records tell us that up to the time of his marriage in November of 1804, Michael is still living in Newbury, and then he marries Sarah Sargent. In the Newbury Vital Records after the marriage, there's no record of Michael. What we find is in Amesbury Vital Records, they record the births of 2 children, one in 1805 and one in 1807. So it's telling us that after the marriage, Michael moves across the river, settles in the West Parish of Amesbury with his new wife, and begins his life there. Now, what's interesting on that is that we know that he didn't come to the West Parish of Amesbury until after November of 1804, which is about 3 years after William Little has already left and moved to New Hampshire. So again, raising some questions about the traditional history. And when I looked at the third individual, Stephen Bailey, who was named in the traditional history, I found that he was also born in Newbury in 1788. And it didn't take long to do the math and say, well, in 1788 to 1800, he was only 12 years old when he was supposedly working as a trimmer for William Little and Michael Emery. And what I found is that he, again, grew up in Newbury. He married in Newbury in 1811. And again, after that, he's not found in the Newbury Vital Records, but the Amesbury records show the births of children starting in 1812. So again, what he did is, after he married, he moved across the river to the West Parish of Amesbury. But in 1812, quite a bit after the beginning of the carriage industry, so-called. So that just, again, raised a lot of questions in my mind. So I was wondering if, I could find other sources that may help shed light on these discrepancies and maybe give us a little better picture of what was actually going on. And what I found was in a history of Essex County that was published in the 1880s, not long after the town of Merrimack was established from the West Parish of Amesbury, there was a wonderful article about the town of Merrimack that obviously talked about the carriage history because it was so important to their origin and their history. And that article included a very long, quite a long list of names that they said of those who are retired or now deceased who were involved early in the carriage industry. So I had that long list of names and then realized that from about 1850 forward, the history of carriage making is actually fairly well documented. The 1850 census of the United States is the first census that lists individuals by name, by age, with their occupations. So we can see who's living where, what they're doing, so we can find out who's making carriages in 1850. And we also have a number of business directories starting in the early 1850s that also list those who are making carriages and where they're working. So with those two sources, I compared that to the long list of names and was able to identify out of that list who was active from 1850 onward. And that left me with a much smaller list of about 12 names of people who must have been working before 1850 in this earlier carriage period. So we had some names to work with. And what was interesting is in that short list, I found the names of Michael Emery and Stephen Bailey, but William Little isn't listed. Instead, his son John Little is listed. And that kind of made more sense because William left in 1801, John bought his house in 1801, so John was there. So it made me take a closer look at John Little as a potential individual. And again, what I found is that when he bought his father's house, he was called a plater, not a silversmith. They used the term kind of sometimes back and forth, but generally what he was doing is he was plating the buckles or whatever, rather than actually making pieces of silver. And so that established him there as a plater. It made some sense. And what I found is that, unfortunately, he died at a relatively young age. He died in 1812, unexpectedly, so he had no will. His probate record, however, because he had no will, has an incredibly detailed inventory of his estate. It lists all of his possessions, all of his real estate, and it actually shows a very well-developed carriage-making operation. It lists his shops, his raw material, his work in process, his finished carriages ready for sale, and as importantly, it lists all of the accounts of money owed by the estate or to the estate from individuals with their names. And what that does is it gives us an idea of who John Little is doing business with. So it added, again, some more information, and most of those names were included in that short list that I had derived from the Merrimack history. So it was pretty interesting. The one thing that made sense is that Stephen Bailey didn't show up in the 1812 accounts of John Little, but we know that he didn't move to Amesbury until 1812, so he probably wasn't quite established yet. One of the names I did find in the accounts of John Little and also was on the short list was the name John Sargent. And I knew that the library at the Peabody Essex Museum had an account book for a John Sargent of Amesbury, so I thought, oh, it might be the same guy. So I had to run over to the library and pull the account book out. And what I found was like striking gold. It was just absolutely amazing. The account book started in 1804 and carried forward to about the early 1830s. And by looking at the accounts, I could tell that John Sargent was a carpenter and a wheelwright. So that really made him in the center of a potential really interesting aspect. And when I studied his account book, what I found is that in 1804, the very first year, he's doing general carpentry work for family members and neighbors, nothing of really much interest. In 1805, he's building a shop for John Little. Also in 1805, he's building a shop for a guy named William Johnson, who's a name that shows up in the Merrimack short list and in the account of John Little. And it turns out that William Johnson is another plater. He actually bought the house of John Little that John sold in 1801 when he bought his father's house. So they were very much tied together, and again, both associated with what I was finding in the historical records. Then in early 1806, all of a sudden John Sargent starts selling sets of carriage wheels and carriages, and the two names that show up are John Little and William Johnson. So it's really the beginning of carriage making activity starting in 1806. And again, because he's a wheel maker, it's interesting because he's selling these wheels to anybody who's starting to build carriages and putting the pieces together. Again, the first ones are the two that I mentioned, John Little and William Johnson. And then very soon, shortly thereafter, a few others, he starts selling one or two sets to people who are doing just, tinkering around making one or two. One of those names is the name Willis Patent. He bought a carriage in late 1806, or a set of activity. And I should mention that when he says the word carriage in his account book, that's not referring to a completed vehicle. In that term, he's referring to what we would call the undercarriage, or the frame to which the wheels and the body are attached to make a completed carriage. So he's doing the wheels and basically the undercarriage that he's conveying to these other people. And Willis Patent, when I looked in the deeds, he first shows up as a blacksmith. And then later on, every once in a while, he's still called blacksmith. Sometimes he's called a carriage maker. So he's getting involved in this. And his accounts are in basically supplying iron to John Sargent, who's using it in making wheels and his undercarriage. He's also showing up in the accounts of John Little, so he's supplying iron findings and pieces for the completed carriage. So Willis Patent, we know, is another name that we can add that was involved at the very beginning of carriage activity in Amesbury. And it made me wonder about, since we know that Stephen Bailey didn't move to Amesbury until 1812, somebody else had to be doing the trimming on these early carriages. So what I did is I looked at the names that were in the John Little accounts to see if I could tease out some information. And there was a name of somebody named Henry Coffin who showed up in the accounts. And when I looked at the deeds, I found that he bought a house in West Amesbury right next to the house that John Little sold to William Johnson. And in the deeds, he's referred to as a trimmer, and in some cases they actually call him a carriage trimmer. So he was of age, and he was there at the time when he was probably the one who was doing the trimming for the carriages that were being made. So basically, what does all this tell us? And what it told me is that with basically some original research into historical records and giving a new look at the tradition of the origin of the carriage industry, we were able actually to put together a much better and clearer picture of who was involved, when and where in the actual origins of the carriage industry. And so it's interesting to add a few names: Willis Patent, again John Sargent, Henry Coffin, that were not listed in Morrill's history, which is the one that's most often cited. So we can actually add more information, more insight, and broaden the history of this industry that was so important not only to the West Amesbury area, Merrimack, but also then moved to Amesbury, and again, we're the carriage town. So it's interesting to get a better feel for the origin of that industry here. So that concludes my prepared remarks. I'd like to open up to any questions that people may have. In the back there, before.
The brick.
Yeah.
Don't care about spoons, don't care about carriages. The brick.
The brick.
Is this an imperial brick?
Yeah, it's called, well, they call it a statute brick. Yeah.
You didn't say anything about where it was made.
It was made probably locally in Amesbury.
It would not have been brought over as
Not brought over as ballast. No, what happened during that period of time is there were itinerant brick makers who traveled around, probably English trained, and they would dig local clay, and they would fire a bunch of bricks for the local people, and then they would move on and do that. Amesbury does have quite an industry of brick making because of the clay along the Powwow and the Merrimack River, but that occurs later on. The first real resident brickyard I can find was at the foot of Water Street right about 1810, or 1710, I'm sorry. So there was bricks being made, but this would have been done locally.
And would it be considered to have been a valuable commodity at the time?
Very much so. Yeah. And again, usually Amesbury doesn't have much in the way of brick houses. Bricks were basically used for the chimneys. Most of everything here is wood frame. There are a few bricks around, but that's not the tradition of the English building, for number one, but they were expensive. And they actually are quite rare. A brick from the 1600s is rare in England. It's even much rarer here in colonial America, and to have it in Amesbury is really kind of an interesting discovery.
You are convinced, in all likelihood, that it was not brought over?
Yes.
It was made somewhere locally?
I think it would have been made locally, yeah.
Would the forms have been brought over?
Easy to make. So I would imagine that they were probably locally produced as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, on the house up on Congress Street, I have 2 spoons that came from out of that yard. Because I remember
okay.
Before they tore it down, I have 2 silver spoons. I have the couple of brass pieces from the old kerosene lanterns. Mm-hmm. I collect the old nails, and one of the back side of the houses there, I actually found some of the old handmade nails.
Yeah, the thing that was interesting about that house is it had been clapboarded over with kind of modern, cheap asbestos siding. It was kind of nasty stuff.
Right, yeah.
Before it came down, I went over and I pulled some of that siding off, and underneath it was the original hand-riven clapboards with the wrought nails that was put there when it was, and this was on the early side, so probably from about 1760, 1770. But it had been preserved because they'd put the other siding over it. So I actually pulled a whole section of wall with the original clapboards and the nails that we can put back together and use as a display at some point. That what happened, most of the articles that we brought are now in the collection of the Bartlett Museum, so we have that as available to be able to use for exhibits on early construction, etc.
Looks like I got a couple of Indian head pennies out of there and a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered what a carriage trimmer does.
Carriage trimmer is basically an upholsterer. So they would do the upholstery work. And I always thought that most carriages were upholstered in leather, but it turns out that a lot of the earlier carriages were upholstered using basically cotton fabrics. most of which was imported from England. And it's interesting, when John Little passed away, he actually died in Boston while he was down in Boston on business. And his accounts show that he was doing business with Joshua Aubin and Company, who later came to Amesbury as the foreman of the first textile mill. But at that time, he was working as an importer of English goods in Boston, and he was selling his textiles to the carriage industry, to John Little. So the trimmer is the one who's doing the upholstery work for the carriages. Yeah.
A lot of times the women did the actual seats and the tufting and things like that. A carriage trimmer would also deal with what's called carriage lace, which is
Yes.
like I don't know how you explain it, but it's sort of like an embroidered.
Yeah, it's again imported from Europe, most likely England.
Yeah.
Very beautifully embroidered bandwork, which they would use to trim usually the flaps that are underneath the seat and along the edges. And it was very beautiful work.
How many employees did John Little have? Do you know?
Probably at this early date, what they were doing is making carriages primarily on a barter system, where again he was kind of putting it all together, but he was buying his wheels and his undercarriage from John Sargent. What I found is that Michael Emery, who Morrill calls a woodworker, was probably a carriage body maker. And that is a very specialized trade that's necessary to have a carriage industry. Wheelwrights can make wheels, upholsterers can upholster chairs, blacksmiths can do whatever with iron, but you need to have somebody who is a carriage body maker, which was a very closely held secret that was passed down almost from master to apprentice. And the reason I suspect that is because two of the other names that were in the short list that I found that were also in the accounts of John Little were the names Joshua Sargent and Edmund Whittier. And when I looked at them, they both died in the 1830s, and in their probate records, they also have inventories that show that they were making carriage bodies. They also were both nephews of Sarah Sargent, who was Michael Emery's wife. So most likely, when he moved to Amesbury in late 1804, early 1805, he would have brought on apprentices to help him in his work and to whom he could pass on his trade. And most likely, those two nephews of his wife were his first apprentices. And by 1812, they were working on their own, making bodies and selling them to John Little.
Do they talk about the kind of carriages they're making? Most of the carriages at that time were called shades.
Exactly.
Of which the Carriage Museum has two.
Yeah. Very interesting. Virtually, in the early years of carriage making, there were only two styles: the two-wheeled chaise and the large four-wheel coach, which was basically what you know as a stagecoach or whatever. It was primarily for very wealthy or for common carriers. The small two-wheel vehicle was the one that was primarily made for individuals. The roads were so bad, most people couldn't even use them. It was a real status symbol to have a carriage at that early age. And actually, when you look at the documents at the time, they don't use the term carriage maker until about the mid-1840s, because all they were building were the two-wheeled chaises. So that's what they referred to as a chaise maker or a chaise trimmer or whatever in the records. Yeah?
What is the earliest carriage that is in the collection, and what artifacts? And you're talking about pre-1850 carriage making. Is there any physical material?
Well, they're very rare. As she mentioned, the Carriage Museum has two.
We have two of them.
Yeah.
And there's no maker name on them or anything, and they do predate 1850 and probably closer to 1820.
Yeah. Anything from that pre-1850, basically pre-industrial age, is extremely rare. And we have up front here, Paulette and Bob Morse. When I was looking at Bob's barn, we were trying to figure out if there was some structural work to do. I found a funny little carriage body sitting in the dirt in the barn, and I said, "What's that?" And they said, "I don't know, it was here when we bought it." And I said, "Can I take a look at that?" And they said, "You can have it." So what I did is I picked it up and took it home and looked at it, and it turned out to be a chaise body. Very beautifully made, all hand-planed wood, mortise and tenon, pin joinery, and it had a wonderful block-printed floor cloth on the bottom that when I took the dust or dirt off, it was extremely bright and almost garish. So I took photographs of that down to the Peabody Essex Museum and showed it to our textile curator and to our American Decorative Arts curator separately. And they both basically dated that design to right around 1835. So that's a very early pre-1850 carriage body. And what's interesting is right next door to where the Morrises live, I know that in the 1820s to 1838, there lived a chaisemaker. So most likely that was built right there in the area, was used by the family that owned their property for many, many, many years, and then was retired, put in the barn, and forgotten about. Yes?
You talked about plating.
Yes.
Little thing that was a plater.
Yes.
Do you have any idea what the technology was?
They were actually doing electroplating. It was a fairly early version, and they would do it in both silver and gold. And in the inventory of John Little, he had 2 plating machines that they refer to. So it was a very early form of electroplating. Yes?
You mentioned Edmund Whittier.
Yes.
What do you know about him? I know quite a bit about John Greenleaf, and Edmund doesn't come up anywhere in that chain.
There were quite a few Whittiers that settled in the West Parish of Amesbury, lived in the area that's was South Amesbury, now kind of the Merrimack Port area that we know about. So there were quite a few there. They intermarried. The Sargents were everywhere. So the Whittiers intermarried with the Sargents, and that's why he's a nephew of Sarah Sargent. I don't know if I've tracked his family all the way back to see how they relate, but there were quite a number of Whittiers in that area. And actually, he was the first, but he had 3 brothers who also ultimately followed in the footsteps and were chaise body makers or carriage body makers at the time. Yes?
You say 1806 for the beginning of the carriage industry. When did it end? When did they...
T.W. Lane supposedly made the last one in 1926.
T.W. Lane?
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were right up on Census Street.
I don't know how accurate it is. Yeah, but I've heard that that actually 1907 is the first year Amesbury built more automobile bodies than they made carriages. 1907. So there was a transition period where, like, T.W. Lane was still making carriages. Other,
T.W. Lane the last?
yeah, pretty well regarded as being the last one that was making carriages.
It's interesting when you look at some of these companies and you see some of the trailblazers were beginning to transition from carriage making to making trolleys or automobile bodies.
Yeah.
Steve just gave the museum a broadside from R.F. Briggs.
Briggs, yeah.
And Briggs started making trolley bodies in 1890.
1888, I believe, even a little bit earlier. So yeah.
And then he made bodies for Locomobile, I think, or one of the...
Yeah, he was, yeah. Actually, for the Stanley Steamer, Locomobile, a number of people. Yeah, the earliest automobile bodies were built actually in West Amesbury again. In 1897, he was building some. And then the first Amesbury bodies are about 1898, 1899. So they started right around the turn of the century, very early on in the carriage industry. One thing that's rather interesting is in 1901, Amesbury body makers shipped 3/4 of all the bodies for cars that were sold in the United States. So it's pretty big.
One of the things I was going to mention about Briggs, Cedar Street is where the factory was located, and the complex there was just listed on the National Register. So that's a pretty notable accomplishment, another mark. And
a landmark that we can identify and preserve.
So let's take one more question,
Yeah.
and then we'll linger and people can socialize.
Can talk, yeah. Barbara, you?
Yeah, you mentioned this early family of Stephen Bailey, but can you comment on the current Bailey family as we know them, from the electric car and then into
the auto business, yeah.
runners?
Yeah, well, the Bailey family settled in Newbury very, very early, so that was their start. And they migrated into Amesbury very early. They migrated all over. And again, the spelling, the traditional spelling of the Newbury family is B-A-Y-L-E-Y versus the B-A-I-L-E-Y. But I see descendants of the B-A-Y-L-E-Y Baileys spelling it the modern way. So it's a little hard. But we know that Sam Bailey came out of Maine, was trained as a very early body maker, actually. That was his initial trade, and then moved to Boston. Then from Boston moved up to Amesbury and started his business here in Amesbury. So he's not directly associated with the Baileys, but I'm sure he's from that same original stock. I don't know if you, Ted, if you know of any more about the history of the family, but it's a name we see all over a long time.
So let's say thank you to Steve for the extra.